So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so I'm Clare Membiela. I'm the library law consultant for the Library of Michigan. If there's anyone on here that has not seen me or doesn't know Library of Michigan and what we do, um, my job is to help libraries across the state understand legal issues and help provide information so that they can make a decision on what their options are. This is my contact information. Please don't hesitate to give me a shout if I can give you a hand or if I can provide information for you. Because we're going to be talking about legal issues today, I have to have this disclaimer up. I do have a master's in library science and I do have a law degree, but I can't be your lawyer. I don't practice. So if you need legal assistance or if you recognize yourself in the discussion when I say something that you shouldn't be doing, you'd want to talk to your attorney. And if you don't have an attorney, I would be happy to provide a list that I keep. So today we're going to be talking about, we're going to do a general overview of library funding. Then we're going to talk about some financial things regarding to libraries, regarding things like public funds and expenditures. We're going to talk about differences between libraries and library friends and library foundations, which are all kind of fundraising groups relating to libraries. And then we're going to kind of get into public libraries and actual fundraising. So when we talk about public library funding in Michigan, because every state is a little bit different with this, in Michigan, public libraries have always been firmly home rule entities. And so that means that public libraries in Michigan are supported and largely run by their local municipalities. So public library in Michigan, we have about 11 different types of public libraries under 7 different laws in Michigan, but all of them are established by municipalities that wish to have libraries. And so part of that is libraries are locally funded. So they're locally supported by the municipalities that they serve. Now, in reality, they are supported at different levels. There is state and some federal and funding that also comes into play, but the bulk of a library's operational funding really should come from their municipality, either a millage or an appropriation. Penal fines. So penal fines are in the Constitution of Michigan as something that is handed over to public libraries. Now, what penal fines are the fines that are paid when someone breaks a criminal law. So it can be anything from traffic violations to drug offenses to pretty much any other criminal act that's against the state laws. If you go to court and part of the sentence or part of the adjudication is a fine, then that money that you pay for that fine will go to a pot of money that's then handed over to the county that the court resides in. And then once a year, that county takes that money, divides it by the amount of population in the county, and then each public library within that county receives a per capita amount. So they receive an amount of money that is computed by taking the number of population that library serves multiplied by that per capita amount that the county treasurer got by dividing that pot of money from the court by the population of the county. In Michigan, that per capita amount varies by county, and it can be anywhere from like 25 cents up to about $15 per person. It varies widely because obviously the way penal fines are gathered is it depends on the presence of state police in your area. It depends, or whether your local police write tickets on the state code. So if you get pulled over by your local township police and you get a ticket, if that ticket is written on a local ordinance, so if on the ticket the number of the law, that it says you violated is a local ordinance, then the money would not go to libraries. If the law written on that ticket is a state law, what we call the penal code, the criminal code, then that would be covered by money would go to public libraries. Traffic laws a long time ago were converted from criminal law to civil law, but the law adjusted, and public libraries still receive traffic fines because when all of this started, traffic fines were criminal. So even though you may see that traffic fines are really civil laws, the money for traffic fines still go to public libraries. But the problem with penal fines, it's really great that libraries get penal fines. We're the only state where it is in our constitution that libraries get penal fines. The problem is that they do fluctuate wildly from municipality to municipality. When laws change, penal fines change. So when speeding limits went up recently, in the last couple of years, penal fines dropped for certain counties. When marijuana became legal, penal fines dropped in certain counties. During the pandemic, obviously they dropped because there wasn't as much activity and not as many crimes being committed or being, let's say arrested or prosecuted. So there's lots of variables that can affect penal fines. State aid is a state program where money out of the annual budget, so the money out of the legislature, the general budget of the state, the legislature allocates or appropriates a certain amount of money each year to be given to public libraries. Right now, we're a little over 15 million. And then again, that pot of money is then divided by the population of the state to arrive at a per capita amount. And then each library gets an amount of money based on the population they serve. However, whereas penal fines are given out, as long as a library is a legally established library and open to the public, state aid has more criteria that a library must meet in order to receive it. There are certain criteria regarding certification of personnel. There are certain regarding community support in terms of the funding the community gives. So, in order for libraries to receive that money, they have to report annually to the Library of Michigan, and the Library of Michigan then makes sure that they cover all of those requirements in order to get the state aid. State aid is also paid out once. It's paid out actually twice a year because it's paid out in two parts. PPT reimbursements, personal property tax. So when the business tax was scaled back and repealed, personal property taxes that had been paid by many businesses no longer went to entities that were levying millages, so they were losing money. So the state devised a program that would reimburse millage holders for PPT payments or revenues that they were no longer getting. So many libraries who have millages will receive personal property tax reimbursements through another program. And that program each year evaluates, the different areas and the different millage holders and sees whether or not they are still, eligible in terms of still losing money. Renaissance zone payments are paid through, and that's another program, if your community has a Renaissance zone, where again, they do not have to pay certain taxes. So the municipalities or the millage holders losing revenue, then there is a payment for that as well. Fines and fees, if your library has overdue fines, or your library charges for certain services like photocopying and stuff, then fines and fees will go to the library for operations and for into their budget. And then we have donations. And a library can receive donations through a wide variety of means, everything from someone just walking in and dropping off $5 to large fundraisers that can raise a fair amount of money. Some libraries also get grants to support certain programs. So what your establishment is in terms of fundraising and your funding also plays a role. Establishment plays a role over everything with public libraries in Michigan. So if you don't know what your library's establishment is, it is particularly important that you find out, whether you are a library director, or whether you are a library board member, or whether you are a friend of a library. Because if you're a friend of a library and you're raising money for the library, you need to know what the establishment is, because that in part could determine the kinds of fundraising maybe you can do. It also helps you understand how that library receives the money, and all of that kind of stuff. Who has the authority to spend the money, all that. So what is your municipal authority over your library will be determined by your establishment. Who sets policies, who's in charge of the financials, who has the authority to expend the money, who has the authority to determine the budget, who has the authority to work with a friends group and determine how money is allocated. Also, the employees. Are the employees municipal employees? Are the employees employees of the library? That could also play a part if the expectation is that the employees will play a role in fundraising. And then also you have to find out whether or not your library has an ability to directly receive donations. So far that I can tell, pretty much every library does have you have to have a statutory permission to receive donations, gifts, and in most cases, like if you're a PA 164 township, or you're a city library or village library, where you have a board, usually an elected board or a 5-member appointed board. The law specifically says that you have the ability, the board has the ability to receive donations and has authority over those donations. Same with district libraries. So know your establishment. Know any agreements or policies, procedures you have with your municipality. A lot of libraries have what's called fiscal agency agreements with their municipalities. So in Michigan, most libraries are distinct from their municipality. So the municipality may have set up the library, but they don't have a lot of input in its day-to-day running, and they don't have a lot of input in the fiscal accounting of the library, other than they may hold the money. Many libraries have an agreement with their municipalities where the municipality does the accounting for the library and may do the payroll for the library. If that's the situation, then whenever you're dealing with money issues, you're going to want to look at that agreement, and you're going to want to talk to your partner there to figure out how these donations may be managed and invested and that kind of thing, or how that's going to look in the budget. Same thing if you have a friends group. Many, and it's highly recommended that libraries have agreements, boards have agreements with the friends group. The reason for that is having a friends group is a separate entity. It's a separate corporate entity. It's not a government entity. It is not part of the library. So in order for these two entities to work together, especially when it comes to money, it is very good to have an agreement between the two that sets out what the expectations of each organization is with regards to the other and with regards to the money. So if the friends group is going to be using library facilities, or if the friends group, wants to know if they can raise money for a specific purpose, or if the library, wants a reassurance that they're going to be able to use some of the friends' money the way that the library feels is necessary to use it. Where does the money go, and who decides what it gets used for? So this is the kind of thing that an agreement between the friends group and the library can be extremely helpful. And can help with a lot of arguments and a lot of conflict. If the library is going to let the board have donated books, for example, how exactly does that happen? And at what point can the library say, okay, these books have been sitting in the library for 2 years, we're going to go ahead and sell them or get rid of them. So that causes a lot of contention. So a written agreement can help with that too. Okay, now we're going to talk about public funds and the public purpose doctrine. In other words, how public funds can be spent. So within Michigan law, in the Public Funds Act, there is a definition in many acts in Michigan. There's definitions of public funds, and essentially a public fund is money that goes into the coffers or is given to a government entity. So it doesn't matter where that money came from, whether it came from the Friends or whether it came from a donation or whether it came from the state or whether it came from, a millage or the municipality. Money that's within the coffers of a public library is considered public funds. Okay. Now, in Michigan, there is a law. Most states have a doctrine or a law or a policy that governs how public funds are used. In Michigan, they've adopted what's called the public purpose doctrine, and the public purpose doctrine says that public monies can only be spent for a public purpose, and a public purpose is essentially anything that is accessible or is of the benefit for the entire the entire community, right? For the general public. So anything that is aimed towards a specific person or a specific group, and where it's limited, so that, for example, you're buying coffee for your staff break room, or you're buying Christmas presents for your staff, or giving bonuses to your staff, or buying lunch for the board. Those are things that are not part of the public purpose doctrine. Now, bonuses can be dealt with a different way. In other words, instead of being given at the end of the year or being given as a separate thing, they can be included as compensation, but that's a whole other training and a whole other discussion. So essentially in Michigan, if you're going to use library money for anything, it has to be for a public purpose. It can't be aimed at specific individuals. And so that's important to know. Now, in addition to that, there are, if you're a 501c3, depending on your type, your exempt type, which we're going to get into in a little bit, you may be required that any funds you raise can only be spent for a public purpose. So that is something else. So just because you raise the money doesn't mean you get to give it to whoever you want. Depending on your entity status and depending on, obviously if you're a government entity, the money that you have can only be used for certain purposes. And we haven't even discussed yet, certain stipulations that a donor may put on a particular donation. So as we mentioned, in Michigan, there are several statutes that give donations, that make it okay for people to give donations or gifts to government entities. A big one is the Michigan Community Foundation Act, which is something that if you're going to be fundraising, I strongly recommend that you take a look at. Under the Michigan Community Foundation Act, if you have a donor that gives you money that is earmarked for a specific purpose, right? So a donor says, I'm going to give you $100,000, but it is specifically for renovation of the children's room. And maybe the library, 5 years ago redid the children's room and wants to use it for something else. The library can't use that money for something else. The library can only use that money for the children's room. Now, there can be a caveat on that, in that if the donor's specific designation is something that is illegal for the library to do, then that can cause some problems, right? So if the donor gives a huge amount of money to the library and says, use this to fund your next millage campaign, well, that could be a big problem. Or if a donor gives the library a big amount of money and says, we would like you to give this to the library director to celebrate her for everything she's done, that would be a big problem. And so you would want to talk to your attorney to figure out, do you go back and talk to the donor? Is there, if you give it, to another entity, is there a way that you'd be able to satisfy what the donor wants to do without violating any laws? But just handing it to the library in certain circumstances, you would not be able to use it for the donor's wish. And that's a situation where, again, you'd want to talk to the donor and you want to make sure you talk to your attorney. In order for funds to be tax deductible for donors, if you're a 501c3 entity, as we mentioned, the donation would have to comply with your 501c3 status. So if depending on what the conditions are, and depending on your entity status, would be used for a public purpose. So we're going to talk a minute about tax deductibility, right? So tax exempt is one thing, and tax deductibility is something else. So tax exempt has multiple, it means, you don't have to pay taxes, you don't have to pay property tax, you have, you don't pay income tax, and it also means very often that people who donate money to you would be able to take that money off their taxes, would be able to take a deduction. Now, the issue here is that currently in Michigan, our tax laws do not really permit deductions for charitable purposes. There are a limited types of donations that can be deducted. Most recently, if you make a donation to a university, you can have that deducted. If there are some other areas that you can deduct, public libraries and government entities right now, if you donate to them, you do not get to take that deduction on your Michigan taxes. As far as your federal taxes are concerned, the IRS tax code change in around 2016 to 2020, that whole revamp of the federal tax code, changed personal, you got a personal deduction of about almost 25 grand. So the choice is, do you take your personal deduction or do you itemize deductions? So if you're someone that would not have more than $24,000 of itemized deductions, then most of the time you would take that personal deduction. And if you take that personal deduction, you then can't typically take the itemized deductions, which means you wouldn't be able to deduct these charitable donations from your taxes. So you'd want to talk to your accountant, but right now in Michigan, soliciting donations, the main reason is not because of a tax issue, at least for individuals. It may be different for, certain situated corporations and things like that, or, if you want to get money from a business person or a company. But for personal individual donations, the big selling point is not going to be you can take it off your taxes. But that's something, again, to talk to your attorney and your accountant with. So let's talk about libraries versus Friends of the Libraries. These two entities, so how do they differ as far as fundraising go, and money, and how are they the same? Well, Friends of the Libraries within Michigan, they are usually tax exempt under 501c3, and they are usually also tax exempt in Michigan under nonprofit corporation status. Many, because they are considered a nonprofit, most friends groups tend to be take the 501c3. They tend to go for the 501c3. A nonprofit corporation doesn't have to, but getting the 501c3 designation opens up a whole lot more options to a nonprofit. And we're going to talk about that in a minute too. Public libraries are automatically tax exempt because they're government entities. So you can see up there, there's a US code section, which is part of the tax code, 170C I think that is, or maybe it's C1, I apologize. So that section is the section of the tax code that says government entities are tax exempt. So a public library doesn't have to get a 501c3 designation to be tax exempt. The problem can be that not everybody else knows that. So it can be a little bit more difficult to kind of, fundraise from a PR perspective. A public library is a government entity. Friends is a nonprofit corporation. A public library is governed by your municipality or your public governing board. So your board of directors. A Friends of the Library is governed by their corporate board, which is something that's required under the Nonprofit Corporations Act, and is something that they would set up as part of their corporate, establishment. Public libraries are covered by state and municipal laws that govern specifically public employees. Friends of the Library are covered by state municipal laws that cover private business. So that doesn't mean that public libraries are not covered by laws, the same laws, some of the same laws that cover Friends Group. What it means is that there are some differences here. So as a public entity, there are some laws that a public library has to abide by that a Friends Group does not have to. And one of those, for example, is public money. When a Friends Group receives money, it's not public money because they're not a public entity. Once that money gets handed over to the library, then it becomes public money. The public libraries are staffed by paid employees and sometimes some volunteers. Friends of the Library are generally staffed by volunteers. Now, some larger Friends groups that heavily fundraise may have a paid person, but having a paid person can change some other things that Friends groups are required and nonprofits are required to take a look at. So depending on the size and the amount of money you raise, most likely you are probably volunteers. So let's talk about now how the money works. So libraries versus Friends of the Library. Libraries may have to answer the municipality depending on their establishment. Their municipality may have a greater or lesser role or autonomy over the money and how the money is spent and how the money is held. Friends of the Library are an autonomous corporation. So the Friends of the Library have total control over their activities, over their money, over their behavior. Public libraries may not have the capacity to manage large or complex donations. So depending on the size of the public library, depending on the amount of staff in the public library, there may not be enough staff, or there may not be the right kind of staff that has the expertise to manage large and complex donations. So if you're going to be fundraising, depending on what your goal is, that's something to consider. On the other hand, Friends of the Library, again, depending on their goals, they should be prepared and have the capacity to deal with the kinds of donations that they're going to be going after. So if you're a Friends group that's going to be looking for large donations, then you should have the capacity and someone there with the expertise, or have, access to somebody with the expertise who can help you handle that large donation. For a public library, fundraising is not your primary mission, right? Your primary mission is providing services and providing information services and access to your community to exercise their First Amendment right of information. For Friends of the Library, that is their primary mission. That's the reason for being, is to fundraise. So again, that can depend on the amount of staff the public library has and the time they have to invest in this other activity on top of their primary purpose. Management of funds restricted by laws governing public funds. So public library have to really adhere to many laws that restrict the use, that govern the accounting of and govern the accountability of public funds. Friends of the Library have different sets of requirements, depending also if they're a 501c3, on how they keep their books, on the reports they have to provide and the accountability they have, but it is not the same as public libraries. Public libraries can be restricted with regards to how staff can assist in fundraising, right? Again, they're public employees that have a specific mission and purpose. So using public funds, they're there to operate the library to conduct fundraising, can be a little sticky. Not that you can't do it, it's that, again, you have to be a little careful and balance it. Taking a staff member away from something that's benefiting the public and having them go do fundraising, again, is one of these issues that can be very situational, and is one of those things that, a library would want to talk to their attorney about in terms of the parameters when and when not a staff member should do that. A staff member on their own time, so off the clock, can help the friends all they want. But on the clock during work time, that gets a little bit more dicey. And a staff member, and we're going to talk about this in a minute, that is required, say, to attend a fundraiser, would most likely have to be paid for that. Public libraries are subject to the Uniform Prudent Management of Institutional Funds Act, and so are Friends groups. And this again is an act. I have a link to it at the end that you're all going to want to take a look at, because this act governs how donated funds are to be managed and accounted for. Libraries are better at communicating their needs and mission, right? So if you look at this chart as something to look at, say, okay, should the library fundraise on their own, or should we have the Friends group do it? Libraries are very good at communicating their mission and what they do and why they need money and what they're going to do with the money and their value to the community. Friends group can be good at that, but in order to be good at that, they have to work with the library in order to understand the message. Doesn't mean friends groups are not as good at fundraising as public libraries. In fact, very often they're much more successful. It's just a point to note. Public libraries can retain 100% of donations, even though some of that money may be used for administrative costs used in fundraising. Friends of the library, depending on an agreement they have with the library, if the Friends of the Library, say fundraise $1,000, there may be a percentage of that $1,000 that the Friends groups retains in order to pay their own overhead costs, right? To pay, anything from the costs of running the fundraiser to reimbursing staff for, expenses the staff made. It could be gas, it could be, you may have to pay, fees for things like filing your annual reports. So all of those kinds of overhead costs, may be taken out of the funds that are donated. If the library receives donations directly, they have full autonomy over the use of those funds, subject to things like the Uniform Prudent Management of Institutional Funds, subject to any kind of condition the donor puts on it. The Friends group receiving the funds has autonomy over the funds they fundraise before they're handed over to the library, subject to any agreement they have with the library for the use of those funds. Once the funds are handed to the library, the Friends no longer have any control over them. And so it's something that the Friends group really needs to work with the library on that. Now, what about library foundations? So a library foundation is generally a 501 nonprofit entity, right? They tend to be larger than Friends groups. They tend to be a little bit more structured and a little bit more operated as a full-time organization. They tend to be a little bit less of a volunteer organization. They tend to have paid staff, and they tend to be a professional fundraising organization. So when I say that, it's not to say that Friends groups aren't professional. It's to say that usually a foundation will have a full-time professional who is a fundraising professional in order to raise money. So it tends to be a little bit more of a larger, like more robust organization. Generally, they go for larger amounts of money. Generally, their purview is not just fundraising and handing money over, but fundraising and then growing those funds. So managing the funds and putting the funds, say, investing them in order to get returns and grow those funds into larger amounts to increase the wealth of the library. So again, it's similar to a Friends group, but a little bit more robust. Again, this is something that usually if you are a large library or you are fundraising large amounts of money, this would be something that you may be interested in. Foundations often act as grant-making entities because they tend to get large donations and they tend to invest those large donations. Often they may take some of the funding and revenue from those large donations and use them to fund grants. So should you be a 501c3? Now, public libraries can be 501c3s because they are non-profit, they are charities. They do meet the criteria, most do. So whether or not you want to be a 501c3, here are some reasons that, may for reasons why people do become, why libraries do. It can be easier and more relatable for donors. So if you're, say, embarking on a large building campaign, it may be good to look into becoming a 501c3, because if you're going to be reaching out to donors who maybe aren't regulars in your community, maybe reaching out to a broader community of possible donors, seeing that 501c3 gives donors some kind of comfort that you're legitimate, because that's something that donors are familiar with. People and even large foundations are familiar with the 501c3, and they know that this entity has been vetted by the IRS. So it gives them a little bit more comfort that their money is going to be handled in an appropriate way. It provides other advantages because of you can get certain advantages from the perspective of sales tax and charitable gaming. Again, mostly this applies to entities that are receiving large donations. So, if you're on the fence about becoming a 501c3, that may be something to take a look at. You have other nonprofits. So having a 501c3 gives you an automatic quote unquote nonprofit label. And the reason why that's useful is public libraries already are nonprofits, right? And in the state, you're considered a nonprofit. But the problem is that if you're going to be trying to get large grants, so if you're a library and you're going to be reaching for large grants, having that 501c3 can be very helpful, because many large foundation and grant-making entities require that grant applicants be a 501c3. And the reason for that is that if you're a Bill Gates Foundation, or you're a Dolly Parton Foundation, or you're a very large foundation that gets thousands and thousands of applications for grants, an easy way to whittle down applicants is to see who is a 501c3 and who doesn't. Having a 501c3 means that you've been vetted by the IRS and you've been validated by the IRS as being an entity that really is eligible for nonprofit status, as opposed to having to look through all of these applications and verify and vet them themselves. So look at, are you a government entity? Are you a school? Are you, that can take a lot of time. So if you get thousands and thousands of grant applications, having to spend time on each application to make sure that the applicant is really a nonprofit can be very time consuming. So that's one of the main reasons why all of these, programs and want you to be a 501c3. It doesn't mean you absolutely can't participate as a government entity. It means you may have to contact the foundation directly and say, look, we're a government entity. We are a verified nonprofit. Is there anything we can do to apply, since we don't have a 501c3? Some entities will let you, some entities won't. The many requirements that you have to go through in order to get a 501c3 align with requirements that many government entities have to do anyway, in terms of managing your money, doing appropriate reporting. So becoming a 501c3 for many libraries is not going to change a huge amount of things that you have to do. But there are some downsides to being a 501c3, or some responsibilities. It does come with restrictions. The biggest restriction has to do with advocacy, limits on political donations, and limits on political advocacy. So that's something that you'd have to know about, particularly if you're a library, as far as, getting a millage campaign. Now, already libraries as government entities cannot do any kind of fundraising. So that kind of aligns. But if you're a friends group looking into being a 501c3, you're going to want to understand what your limitations are there. Depending on the library's exempt organization type, donated funds may be limited in how they can be used. So the IRS divides up, tax exempt organizations into different types. One of those types are charitable organizations. And within charitable organizations, very often you're people who become a 501c3 because they're a charitable organization are labeled as public charities. And when you look up your organization on the IRS tax exempt site, you'll see that PC in your account there. A PC means public charity. If you're a public charity, then any donations you receive can only be used for a public purpose. So you're back to that same restriction that you have with your own funds as far as the library is concerned. So you have to be very careful about, if you're a 501c3, funds that you are receiving under your 501c3 status, you can only use for a public purpose. Now, you can say, well, we already can only do that with our library money. Well, this means that if your friends is a 501c3 and you receive money from the friends, you have to be very careful how that money gets used. If you are, as a public library, a 501c3 and your friends is not a 501c3 and you receive the money, you still have to be very careful. So it essentially says that for a public library, it's not going to change much in how you can expend the monies. For a friends group, it can change how you're going to spend the money. So that's something else to consider. A lot of it depends on what is the friends group mission and what do they anticipate spending the money on. Having the 501c status requires annual reporting with the IRS. If you do not do that annual reporting after a certain amount of time, I think it's 3 years, your 501c3 status gets dropped. And you just don't have it anymore. And then you have to kind of reinstate it, which is a process. If you are a friends group, you also have to report annually, but that should be a little easier for friends group because as a nonprofit corporation, they would have to report annually to the Attorney General, or not the Attorney General, I'm sorry. They have to report annually to LARA, which is the entity in Michigan, the agency that manages corporations. So either way, a friends group is going to have to report, or a foundation are both going to have to report to 2 entities annually. So that's not as much of an onus for a friends group, but a library may not be used to having to do that annual reporting. So you got to make sure that somebody's on top of that. It's not difficult, but you just got to make sure somebody's on top of it. So annual record keeping and reporting may be different from what the library's used to. So you may have to realign some financial reporting from your budget and from your accounting system and your uniform chart of accounts to make sure that you are in compliance with that. Essentially, with a 501c3, your records always have to be available for review if the IRS or someone else asks. So that's, but same thing with the public entity. The only difference is the types of reports may be different. Under the 501c3 status, you have to pay your staff a fair market wage. So for most libraries, not going to be a problem. If you're a library that is paying staff very, very low, this may be something to consider and talk to your attorney about if you want to become a 501c3. The Charitable Organizations and Solicitations Act. So this is an act that governs soliciting and fundraising. So if you're an entity in Michigan that is fundraising or soliciting funds for a charitable purpose, you have to adhere to this act. So this applies to everybody, whether you're a foundation, whether you're a friends group, or whether you're a public library. It applies whether you're a 501c3 or not. If you're asking for money, then you have to comply with this law. So what you have to do is the Attorney General has a website for charitable, Charitable Organizations Solicitations Act, and it's called Charitable Trusts. And when you go to it, you fill out a form with the Attorney General that describes your entity, whether you're a public library or you're a foundation. There are certain entities that are exempt from the annual reporting requirements that this act has. Public libraries are usually exempt because you're a government entity. The friends groups may be exempt if you raise less than $25,000 a year and you have all volunteers. So if you match those descriptions, then you have to file with the Attorney General under this act. Essentially let the Attorney General know you exist, but you don't have to do the annual reporting. However, you do have to follow the sections of the act. So there are things like the laws governing, donor privacy, and the laws governing documentation that you have to give to potential donors, that talk about your organization and talk about how the money is going to get used. So again, if you're going to do fundraising, this is an act that you're going to want to read very carefully to make sure that you're prepared to comply with it in your fundraising activities. Okay, now let's talk about types of fundraising. So now we're down to the nitty-gritty with actual fundraising. So all of that was background and stuff you have to know in order to get to fundraising. So types of fundraising are things like anonymous donations, which is where you have like a jar where you say, donate, or you have like, you see the, firemen out there with the boots getting the donations. That's all anonymous donations. There are, if you want to do something like that, there are different municipalities have different charter and ordinance sections that requires pre-approval, particularly if you're going to be doing it on public sidewalks or public streets. It could present, this kind of fundraising can present a PR issue with your library if your library already has a millage, right? So if you're already in your community and you ask your community for, they're paying $100 a year in taxes to support the library, and now you're out there asking for more money just for the library, then you may end up in some uncomfortable conversations. So this is a type of fundraising that you want to make sure you have really good story. You have a really good explanation for your community as to why you're asking for this money on top of a millage. The accountability of funds can be difficult, right? So if you're receiving donations in quarters and nickels and dollars here and there, the chain of accountability from the person putting the money in the can to the person with the can getting the can to the place where maybe money is centralized, or to the next person, and then that person getting the money to be counted, and that person getting the money to the bank, there's lots of opportunities there for money to go missing, for things to be miscounted. So the accountability of funds can be not as great. So that's something to consider. May or may not be the best way for you to do fundraising. There's fundraising that require purchases, right? So like a silent auction where you have an array of goodies that people bet on. Very often the items go for over what it might cost to buy them individually, and the money goes to a charitable purpose. Sometimes the things are donated things, so the entity that is doing the fundraising does not put out any money. Or other events requiring tickets. So things like if you have a gala, or a dance, or a dinner, or a murder mystery, or something like that, that you charge money for, and then the money for the tickets goes towards the charitable purpose. Now, some of the issues here to think about are, whenever you either sell something as part of a charitable, or like have tickets, the amount of money that the donor pays, the actual cost of what they receive, so the value of what they receive. So if I put a donation on a silent auction, and let's say it's a gift card for $100, and I bet $150 to this charity to get this $100 gift card, then the charitable amount that I donated was $50. Because even though that gift card may have been donated, so to the charity, they're getting $150. For me, as the donor, it's only $50 that I donated because I got fair market value of something I purchased. So that's something to consider. The same thing can happen with a murder mystery or a gala, right? So the amount of money, so if someone buys a ticket, then the fair market value of what they're getting may have to be subtracted from their donation before they can get any kind of, if they're going to, deduct it or any kind of benefit. The entity, especially for something like, because a lot of times with silent auctions, the items are donated. If you have to buy the items, then yes, the money that you receive, you'd have to subtract in order to find out what your true donations were, what your benefit was. Anything requiring tickets, you'd have to subtract the cost of the event, right? So that also is something to consider. And some of that cost may be staff salaries, right? If you're using library staff. So that can eat up a lot of costs. So that's something to also consider. If you're using the library facility as a venue for these, one of the things you really have to look at is your municipal ordinances and municipal policies on the use of public buildings. So even if the library owns the building, the library is still a municipal entity, right? It's still a government entity. So you still have to look at those ordinances and charters and make sure that what you're doing conforms with what's required under your local law. And there could be things like you're not allowed to have alcohol on the premises, right? So if your location, or if your municipality has an ordinance that says, no alcohol in public places or no alcohol in public buildings, then that's something you're going to have to talk to your attorney about before you have a big gala where you have a bar. Doesn't mean you can't do it. It means you really have to just make sure that you do it right. Gaming. So gaming is a very popular way to get money. This is popular with a lot of churches and some other government entities. The thing about gaming is it can be very lucrative, but it requires licenses. The laws are very strict. It even, especially with certain things like raffles and bingos, the laws are exceedingly strict with very limited exceptions. So even having a raffle for summer reading can be difficult. You want to make sure that you follow the guidelines, and if you have any questions, you call the Gaming Commission because you don't want to be on the wrong side of that. Never take for granted that, oh, we can do this because it's for charity or it's for the library or it's a government thing. No, always double check and get the appropriate permissions and licenses that you need. Because otherwise it's not worth the trouble, frankly. If you're going to do gaming, you have to make sure that you adhere to the guidelines. It's not just getting a license. There's requirements that go with that. How many people have to be there to oversee it, how the money gets handled, how things get counted out at the end of the night, a report that has to be sent. It gets more complicated as you get higher with things like doing like a millionaire party or a like casino night. So you're going to want to make sure that you just follow the guidance and you do what you're supposed to do with that. The Gaming Commission can be very helpful with that. So don't be afraid to ask questions. Alcohol laws. Same thing. Make sure that you have the appropriate licenses and permissions if you're going to be serving alcohol. Don't just assume that the caterer you're using, or if you're bringing in a brewery or something to do a tasting, don't automatically assume that they're going to come in with all the appropriate licenses. Make sure you check with them and you communicate with them to ensure that at least that the proper documentation is there. Make sure that there's a good process in place for ensuring that underage patrons and underage people do not have access to that alcohol. And again, make sure you look at your municipal rules on things like having alcohol in the building. Make sure your liability and your property insurance is appropriate for the kind of event you want to have, right? Make sure you consult your attorney. There have been just some recent fairly important changes to what we call premises liability. Premises liability is the area of law that if somebody is on your property and they trip and fall, or slip in an icy parking lot, or fall down a pair of stairs because, the banisters loose and they might have had a couple drinks, they could sue you. So you're going to want to talk to your attorney about these changes and whether or not, there's something that you need to adjust in either your liability insurance or in your event. Does the fact that you have gambling or alcohol on the premises affect your insurance? If you're a public library, and then all of a sudden you're going to have this big event that has alcohol and gambling, just double check with your insurance company and your liability insurer and make sure that there isn't anything additional you have to do because you're having those and things on your property that you don't normally have. And what if an event is offsite, right? What if the library is going to, or the friends are having a fundraiser that is in another building or outside? You'll want to double check all of that as well with your insurer, and the same licensing and rules for getting all the proper permissions are the same. It's probably a good idea if you're a friends group to have at least one or two members who are very versed in these licenses and these, like one person, the gambling person, one person, the alcohol person, just because it can be very convenient to have someone who really understands what's going on and can then adopt new things as they come out. Accessibility and ADA requirements still apply. If you're having a fundraiser and it's an event, you still have to follow the ADA and make sure that that event is accessible to members of your community with disabilities. So that's something that you're going to also want to keep in mind. Employment issues. Staff, if they're going to be required to attend fundraisers outside of work time, you're going to have to pay them for it. You can't force your staff to volunteer on their own time. And if a staff member wants to volunteer, that gets a little sticky as well. I would talk to your attorney. There are some laws in Michigan that forbid people from volunteering for things that they should be being paid for. So some of these lines get a little gray, and that's why it's a good idea just to talk to your attorney just to be safe. So if you're a library that you have people who work at night, and you're having an event at night and you're closing the library, don't automatically assume that you can take those people who work at night and make them work your fundraiser. You're going to want to double check because there are some Fair Labor Standards Act and wage and hour things that govern things like schedules and whether or not the entities are closed or open. So you're going to want to double check with your attorney there as well. Remember your laws that restrict personal enrichment in contracting. If you have, a business and you want to donate stuff to the library, or you have a business and you want to rent out your business to the library for a fundraiser, doesn't mean you can't do these things. It means you want to make sure you do it right with the appropriate disclosure. And if you're a board member, you're refraining from voting and all of that stuff. So again, as those come up, just be aware of that, whether you're a staff member, whether you're a director, whether you're a board member. And same thing applies with friends groups, because friends groups, there are, conflict of interest rules that govern corporations as well, even though you're not a government entity. Impact of partnerships. So unintended consequences of corporate or private partners. So if the library or the friends group is going to be partnering with another entity for a fundraiser, this just means look before you leap, right? So you just want to be careful, because depending on your partner, if they have skeletons in their closet, if they have, any kind of background of inappropriate fund use, or there's a hot button political issue that they're on one side or another that the library, is uncomfortable about, you may want to just be careful who you work with from a PR perspective, right? So that, remember what you want to do is you want to raise money, right? So you don't want unintended consequences of something getting in the way, or a controversy getting in the way of that and actually hampering you in doing what you want. Public entities can't endorse things, so you have to be careful about that too. So if you're going to partner with a company, then you may want to talk to your attorney because you want to be careful about looking like you're saying, hey, you know, this public library, we endorse this product. You want to be careful about that. Looking at the balance of time and money spent on fundraising versus library operations, right? So again, if you're a library that's going to be self-fundraising, you're going to want to look carefully at the amount of time you allocate to fundraising versus the amount of time and assets and energy you're allocating to your primary function. And so that's an important thing as well, not only for spending your budget, but for accountability for your community. So donors and charitable giving, including bequests. So one of the things, if you have, we have lots of libraries who have been fortunate enough to just be handed money, right? They didn't solicit it. Someone just said, you know, in their will, gave them many, many thousands of dollars, which is awesome. But it's important that you understand how to handle this and the things you should be thinking about. First of all, if you're going to solicit money, or even if you just receive money, it's not a bad idea to have a gift policy. So gift policies set out for an institution, and again, this is also important for friends groups and foundations, especially friends groups and foundations as entities that go out and fundraise. So a gift policy is essentially the procedure that an entity has that shows what kind of gifts they will not take, how the administration works for accepting gifts, and it can just kind of help the process. It lets donors know ahead of time, the kind of things that the library can't handle, the kind of things that the library will handle. If the money is going into the city coffers, it lets donors know that. There are some donors that get negatively surprised when they give the money to a library and the money ends up in the government's account. And again, that depends on the establishment of the library, and it also depends on the way that the donation or bequest was written in the will. So a big thing is the list of things that you don't want to accept as a gift, right? And this may sound funny, like who would turn down a gift? But there's actually real reasons for this. Libraries are not going to want to take stock because in Michigan, public entities cannot own stock, right? So if someone wants to give you, a whole bunch of GM stock, you can't accept it. It can be sold and the money given to you. So if someone actually gives it to you, it would just have to be sold. You can't maintain stock. And it also, you have to keep in mind, if someone hands you a bunch of stock, well, now you have to sell it. And now that's going to cost money, because it's going to cost money to get a broker. It's going to cost, depending on when you sell it, you may not reap the amount of money that the donor thinks you will. So stock is generally something that a lot of government entities especially say, no, we don't want to take. Property. There's a lot of horror stories about libraries and government entities that were handed property, and the property turned out to be a brownfield, or the property turned out to be unusable, or the property turned out to have so many restrictions on it that it turned into something that was more of a problem than a gift. For example, if someone gives you a condo, right? Or an apartment or a house, and they say, oh, but my daughter gets to live there until they're out of college. So, okay, now the library is a landlord, right? So now the library has to maintain that and act as a landlord for that person living there until they move out and the library gets the property. So you always want to look at, especially unusual donations, with a critical eye, and just look at it from the standpoint of, okay, are there unintended consequences here? And are we going to end up paying money to have this gift? And that, like articles like antiques and old books, how much of a problem is it going to be for the library to turn this into money? And if it's something that the donor says, you're not allowed to sell it, I'm giving it to you on the condition that it never gets sold. Well, does the library, especially if it's valuable, does the library have the facilities to maintain it, right? Do you have the right conditions to, the everything from the humidity to security to, can you maintain this? If it's a painting or it's a sculpture or whatever it is, that's something you have to consider. So a lot of gift policies could say that, the library reserves the right to turn down the gift if the library finds that the library cannot maintain or cannot adequately manage the gift, or something like that. So it's not like you're saying we don't like this, you're just saying this is really not something that we're going to be adequately able to take care of in the way it needs to be taken care of. The disposition of a gift or bequest once received. You want to have in your policy, okay, once you give us a gift, this is what happens. If you give us stock, it will be sold. If you give us a bunch of donated books, if we can't use those books, we're going to pass them on to another entity, or we're going to recycle them. Here's how we make that decision. If there's an option for the person to get books back that you don't want, and that is something that you'd want to make sure is in your gift policy. Will the money come straight to the library, or will the money go to the municipality, who will have discretion over those funds? Will you invest these funds in it? And this is as much for your internal use as much as the gift giver, right? So your staff and your administration in a library has to know how to handle this when it comes, or your municipality has to know how it's handled once it comes. So we get this money, what do we do with it? Does it have to go in the library fund? Does it go into a investment? Does it go in a municipal fund? So those are kinds of things you're going to want to think about, so that when you get a large donation, you're not sitting around going, oh, well, what are we going to do with this? Oh, and there's not a chance that, for example, municipality or another entity is going to come in and say, you know what, we'll take that, we'll take care of it. You want to make sure you keep an eye on that Uniform Prudent Management of Institutional Funds Act, so that you're managing donor information correctly, and you're managing the types of investments that you can put those donated funds in. Managing conditions on gifts. So if someone offers, donates money to you or gives you a bequest, but puts on it, you can only use this for a children's display honoring this author that I adore, or something like that. You can say, this building can only be used for library purposes, right? If a donor is going to give you a building, right, which has happened a lot in the history of Michigan libraries, and they give you a building for the library, it's good for them to say this building can only be used for library purposes. Because if they just donate a building, who knows what happens in the future? And depending on the library's establishment, and depending on the relationship between the municipality and the library, down the road, that building could very easily become a municipal building and not a library building. So the more that a donor specifically designates something as something that in perpetuity has to be used for the library, the better often it is for the library. If the donor says, I'm giving this to the municipality to be used for the library, again, depending on your establishment, that could be the way it needs to be. But very often, the donor might be better off just saying, I'm going to give this to the library. Because if it goes to the municipality first, then there can be arguments over how much control over those funds does the municipality have versus the library. And can the municipality determine how that money is used for the library? Are you going to invest it? And again, keep an eye on, are you going to use a community foundation? And keep an eye on both the community foundation law and, the Uniform Prudent Management of Institutional Funds. Make sure you have a clear policy for how unwanted gifts are going to be handled, right? You don't just say no. You want to do it diplomatically. You want to make sure there's lots of thanks involved. If we're talking about a considerable sum or something valuable, you want to have somebody skilled who can talk to the donor and maybe work something out, right? Maybe, overcome the thing that's causing the problem. Make sure that you always say thank you, right, to your donors. So this is if you receive gifts and you sell them in order to get the money, as we talked about, that's in the Community Foundation Act. So that permits things like you receive donated books and you're going to sell them. You receive a piece of property and you don't want to keep it, you're going to sell it. Artwork, you're going to sell it. Excuse me. So you want to make sure you have a good plan in place for that. However, depending on the amount of money, this is something, again, that you want to make sure you have a good attorney you can talk to, because there are IRS reporting requirements depending on certain amounts of money. And I mean recording requirements outside of the 501c3 things you already have to report. Okay, this is the last thing on our list here. I see we're a tiny bit over, but we should still have some time for questions. Crowdfunding. So this has become a very popular way that municipalities fundraise. You may have heard about like Patmos, and they got crowdfunded. And it's actually becoming a very popular way for any government entity to get funded. Municipalities are starting to crowdfund. You want to make sure that you choose your platform carefully. There's a lot of crowdfunding platforms, and some of them are better than others. You want to make sure that the platform has the reach that you want in terms of the social media participation. You want to make sure, do you want a national crowdfunding, or you want a local crowdfunder? Is there an advantage to using a Michigan crowdfunder? Different platforms have different corporate philosophies and different practices that could work against you. Their fees could be too high. They could not adequately promote your fundraiser, or if you go to if someone is looking to donate money and they go to the fundraising platform site, there could be things that don't bump your fundraiser at the top of the list there. So there are different things that you want to look at to make sure that, just like you would with any other vendor, that this platform is one that you want to align your brand with, and you want to make sure that you align the library with. There's not going to be any unintended consequences or bad PR. Like if the crowdfunding has, a skeleton in its closet, like it mismanaged money several years ago, that's something you'd want to know about and maybe not go with them. Does your municipality have a relationship with a platform? Have they already crowdfunded? Or maybe an adjoining municipality? Like I said, this is becoming very popular. If they have, then maybe you want to use the same one. Maybe there's a benefit to using the same one, the same platform. Because the donors that already donated to that other municipal thing already used to this platform, and maybe it would be easier for them to go to that one, and it's something they already look at. Always read the fine print. And I know it's tedious. I know most of us go on these things and don't look at it. We just click yes and agree. If you're acting for your entity, make sure you read all the fine print. That's very important. The percentage of your donations that's kept by the platform, whether and how they promote it, whether their privacy practices conform with the state requirements for donor privacy. That is very important. So you're going to want to make sure that that all aligns before you join with them. Understand that the money you're raising are still public funds, because you're raising them for the library. The minute they go to the library, they're public funds. Determine ahead of time how these funds are expected to be used. Don't just fundraise a pile of money for some purpose, library operations, or to buy books. Try to have a story that you are looking for to promote, and how you're going to invest this money and how you're going to account for this money, so that if a donor asks, you have all that readily available to send them. And that's also part of the law of the prudent investing, is that you have to make sure that certain information is available for donors. So you want to keep that going with this if you're going to be crowdfunding. can you spend library funds for fundraising? So the answer is generally it's probably okay. But there are shades of gray here, right? As long as your fundraising event directly benefits the library and a public purpose. So we are generating funds for summer reading. We are generating funds to buy new computers for the library. Something that's a public purpose. You're getting something that the whole community is going to be able to use. You don't want to fundraise for, retirement party for a board member because that's not a public purpose. You're spending, you should have a budget. So your fundraising should be part of your budget. You should budget for it in your annual budget. And you want to make sure that your events, the cost of the events, do not exceed your expected benefit. Now, sometimes you have a fundraiser that just doesn't go the way you expect, and that happens. But in the planning stages, you don't want to plan for something that's unrealistic, right? Don't plan for something that you hope is going to be great, but you're not sure because maybe your community is too small to really support something like that. Or it's just beyond the means. If you're going to have a fundraiser, you're going to be selling tickets for $200, but your community is a community, with an average income that maybe is not going to support that, then that might not be the best way to spend your money, right? Because you're accountable for this. So you want to make sure that you have realistic expectations and planning for your fundraise. Be careful of lavish events. Not only because very often the administrative costs overtake what you receive, but sometimes they don't look very good, right? So if in your community, again, you have a library millage and the library is asking for money, but once a year, the library board has this huge fancy party, a lot of people aren't going to necessarily understand that. And you could get a lot of backlash from that. So I would recommend, it's probably not the best idea to do a lavish fundraiser. Again, it can depend on your size of library. So, there's no absolutes, but this is something that I would approach with caution if someone has an idea to do this. Administrative costs still include use of library facilities and assets and staff. So if you're photocopying flyers, if you are buying napkins and cups and all of that kind of stuff, all of that counts as administrative costs for the fundraiser. You want to make sure you maintain those good records and documentations on the cost of the event, what was purchased, what money was used for that purchase, how much the fundraiser brought in order, again, because you're accountable to your donors as well as to your community. Make sure that, if you're not sure about something, talk to your attorney. To assess a certain policy or before you start using your public funds for fundraising when you're planning things out. If you are a library friends group and you're a corporation, you're going to want to make sure that the attorneys that you work with are nonprofit attorneys and corporate attorneys. So a public library and a friends group should not be using the same attorney, because a public library is going to be working with a municipal attorney, a library law attorney. A friends group needs to work with an attorney that is very versed in nonprofit law and versed in corporate law. So that's an important distinction to understand. So is it worth it? Well, it depends. So again, depending on your library staffing and your relationship with your municipality, it may or may not be useful to fundraise yourself. If you do have a really good event, then it can be easier to repeat it, so that once you put in all the hard work to start this up, if you do it right and you're successful, then a lot of times it just runs itself. It becomes not as difficult the next time. It can take a lot of time to manage donated funds. So you're going to want to be prepared for that. And if necessary, make sure that you have somebody on your staff who can do that kind of work, right? And who maybe that's part of their job. If the library has a really good friends group, maybe the library doesn't need to self fundraise. If the library feels it needs to self-fundraise, but it has a really good active friends group, maybe there needs to be a conversation between those two entities, because it sounds like maybe the library is not getting everything it needs, or the library is not happy with how the funds are being handled. So again, an agreement between the two entities can be extremely beneficial for both entities. Evaluate your need to fundraise versus, any effect it could have on your current funding, right? If you're going to really aggressively have a fundraiser and that may upset your community, and you have a millage election coming up, maybe that's not the best time to start fundraising, right? So you need to do that benefit risk analysis. Even if you're not an active fundraiser, having a 501c3 for a library can be very beneficial to receive grants and participation in programs that only accept nonprofits. It can just make things a lot easier for you. One of the things fundraising lets you do is target. So you can target specific groups to support specific resources, like families, in order to fund an after-school program, right? So instead of going to all of the library community where they're all paying a millage, go to the targeted group that are going to most benefit from this program and fundraise with them. And you may find a niche that, okay, yeah, you pay library millage, but guess what? You also pay child care, or you also, maybe, a library of things, right? You also buy tools. Well, funding this is going to give you an added benefit above and beyond your millage. So, things like that could be beneficial if you target it that way. There are several screens of resources here to support what I've said, so that you can go back and look it up yourself and get some additional information and support. That is the end. It looks like we do have a few minutes for questions. Becky, do we have any questions?
We do have a few in the chat, yes.
Okay.
If the library building has four rented apartments above the main library, any recommendations on how to proceed? We have property manager, but we have had water in the library as a result of renter actions.
Okay. So there are a couple possibilities here. If some of this could depend on the ownership of the building. So if the library owns the building, so the board has control over what happens in that building. One of the things you could do is, get rid of the apartments, don't have them, and consider another use for that space. If the income generation was important to you, then there could be other use for that space, maybe a meeting room that you charge for, but that is something that your board, would discuss the costs and benefits of. If the board wants to keep the rented apartments, then the water lamp could renters oxide. So there are ways that landlords can deal with things like that, and some of that would be what's written in your lease. Some of it could be, court action. Going after the renter for damages. It sounds like you may want to have someone take a look at the lease for your building to see if it can be improved to help address issues like that, and who's responsible for issues like that. As well as if you have a contract with the property manager, that's something else that maybe might need to be looked at. But if the amount of money you're receiving from the renters is not worth the hassle, and you're not really getting a lot of revenue from it, you're basically just kind of paying to keep it going, then depending on the ownership of the building, you may want to consider just getting rid of the apartments and using the space for something else. And that's something that maybe could be a fundraising goal, depending on what the board decides they want to use it for. So that's kind of what I would do. Our friends groups assuming 501c3 status allowed to advocate for millage. Yes, but you have to just make sure that you do it in the way that's permitted. So a lot of the 501c3 deals with the amount of money you're allowed to donate. So you have to make sure you stay within that limit. So as long as you are within the limits of the 501c restrictions, and there's lots of material. If you go to the IRS website, and in the upper right-hand corner, there's a link for charitable organizations. Within that area, there's a whole lot of information about 501c3s. So I would recommend taking a look at that because it'll go through what you can and cannot do. And if you email me directly, Gina, I think I also have some materials that I can give you. So yeah, you are allowed to advocate. It's just there's some limits. Also keep in mind that individual members of the Friends group can advocate for the millage as individual citizens. So as long as you don't identify yourself as a member of the Friends group and you're just volunteering as a citizen and as a library patron, that's allowed. As a Friends group, you do not want to be in charge of, say, the campaign committee or the Yes committee, because that would be a problem with your 501c3. But as far as participation, there are some things that you can do. What restrictions should we be aware of when using public funds for promotional advertising purposes? So if you're talking about just general, the library can have a marketing and PR budget. As far as promotional advertising for your fundraising, it's like the same thing. As long as the fundraising activity is for a public purpose, you can put that in your PR budget for advertising. But again, like any other cost, you're going to want to be careful. You're not going to want to like go crazy. You want to balance the amount of money you're spending against the amount of money you think that you're going to get back. And you don't want to do anything that's going to be a negative to the library and its regular operations. But for sure, the library can have a budget for PR and marketing. And again, when you're marketing the library, you want to be careful that you're getting fair market value. So you're buying a billboard, you get fair market value, you give the community or you give your municipality money so that you get a booth at the fair, that's fine. But you want to not do things like donate to a charity to sponsor something. If you're gonna do promotion and advertising, you got to make sure you get something tangible in return. You get something real in return. It's not a donation. So your promotional money that you give should not be a donation. So quote unquote a sponsorship. It should be an actual kind of for lack of a better word, tangible type transaction, so that you're giving fair market value for what that advertising would cost. What is an example of crowdfunding? So crowdfunding would be like GoFundMe, where somebody posts, we're raising money for X. Can you guys, send me money through this online or social media system? So it's a way of like there's sometimes business have been using Kickstarter, if you've heard of that one. I think at Patmos it was GoFundMe. So it's a lot of things where a lot of regular people will ask for money for stuff or try to raise money for various purposes. So a municipality or public library can do the same thing on these social media or online platforms, and you're just essentially asking the world to give you money. Is there a distinction between a legal bingo game and what many libraries do for summer reading, which is structured very differently and something not done as a group? So essentially, the key distinction with bingo appears to be that if the participant has to give something in return for playing, so if something of value has to be traded in order to play, then that's gambling. So if a kid has to turn in uh, you know, a review of 3 books they read, or if they're required to do something in order, or hand in something in order to play, that could get sticky. If it's just an activity where it's just purely an activity and the kids don't have to like read 5 books before they can play, then that's not gambling. So the idea is risk, right? um, and even that idea with reading the books is kind of on the line. So you could talk to your attorney about, a risk benefit analysis. Is someone really going to come out after you because you're asking kids to turn in a sheet that said they read 5 books before they can play the bingo? Odds are, in the bigger scheme of things, no, unless you're giving a prize away for that bingo, and that prize is a pretty hefty prize. So if you're giving away a bike or a game system or something as a prize for that bingo, then I would steer clear of requirements. But if the bingo's just for fun, then you're probably okay. Friends group with 501c3 status have to pay Michigan sales tax on money raised from fundraisers such as book sales. So I'm going to say maybe. This is kind of more of a complicated question than I can really answer in this kind of forum. Lori, if you email me, I can send you a document that I wrote on this. There are some circumstances where you would have to pay sales tax, but there are different things, like it depends on different factors. So if you send me an email, I'd be happy to put that out there. If you're making a profit, but you're receiving community goodwill, if you're not making a profit, but you're receiving community goodwill, is that the reason enough to keep doing it? So I would say that's hard to say without knowing the facts. It may be, but if the amount of money and effort and resources that the library is spending on that is way out of whack with the benefits from that community goodwill, then it may not be. So if the library is spending an inordinate amount of money and effort and staff time on a particular thing, and what they're getting back, they already have a community that loves the library, and their millage isn't in danger, then again, you have to look at, well, should we use that money and effort to provide something else for the community? So that's kind of a question that only you and the board can really answer, to do that analysis. And depending on the situation, I know that there could be community history, there could be all kinds of things wrapped up into this. So again, without knowing more about specifics, it's hard for me to say, but it's possible that it would be. Oh, as a fundraiser, yeah, it's possible it would be. But again, you're going to want to ask yourself, weigh that risk benefit analysis. Is that if you're not making a profit and you're spending money, well, now the library is spending money. So is that a public purpose? And is that public purpose, are you getting your money's worth out of it? And that's something that you have to look at. Okay. Thanks everybody for coming. Thanks a lot. Have a great weekend, everybody.